Hello again, everyone. I'm Father Joe Nazzle from Sanino Mission House in Berkeley. We enter the third week of Lent, and the dispatches from the war-torn country of Ukraine are devastating. The Associated Press reported from the southwestern city of Mariupol, near the Russian border, which has been under siege for more than 2 weeks. And they report witnessing the bodies of children dumped into this narrow trench hastily dug into the frozen earth. Survivors bury the dead in mass graves as bombs continue to fall. As Ukrainians continue to courageously resist the invasion by Russia, last week we heard reports of Russia bombing a maternity hospital, and the world watched the heart-wrenching scene of a pregnant woman being pulled from the wreckage. She and her child did not survive. This week it was a theater where hundreds of people had tried to escape the shelling by seeking shelter there. The AP reports a portrait of unimaginable suffering. An 18-month-old girl whose shrapnel wound to the head proved too much for her little body. There's the 16-year-old boy named Ilya, whose legs were blown up in an explosion during a soccer game at the school field. There was a girl no older than 6 who wore pajamas with cartoon unicorns, who was among the first of Mariupol's children to die from the Russian shelling. Our Precious Blood missionaries in Poland have 4 retreat houses which they've opened up to provide shelter for families escaping the carnage. I wrote this past week or 2 weeks ago to our former provincial there. I've known him for many years, and I just wrote to offer my prayer and solidarity, and he wrote back and said there are no words to describe what is happening now in Ukraine. It is not only war, but barbarism, the slaughter of innocents. Our readings this Sunday reflect similar atrocities, injustices, oppression. The first reading from the book of Exodus reveals how God witnessed the suffering, the affliction of my people in Egypt, and have heard their cry of complaint against their slave drivers. So I know well what they're suffering, God says. You know, I've heard from many people these past few weeks, why doesn't God hear our prayers for the people of Ukraine? Why isn't God listening? What's the point of praying when there's so much evil and suffering in the world? The question echoes the age-old question that Rabbi Harold Kushner addressed in his famous book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, that if God exists, why is there suffering in the world? And he drew upon his own personal experiences of watching his beloved son Aaron die of a rare disease when he was only 14 years old. Rabbi Kushner wrestled with these questions for several years. How could a good and kind and just God treat a child this way? Most explanations of suffering, he said, serve more to excuse God than to explain suffering. But Rabbi Kushner wrote that God is as outraged by our misfortunes as we are, because God is indeed good and kind and just. But God allows suffering because God is leaving room for human beings to act. Our readings remind us that God knows what we're suffering. And rather than simply remain aloof or distant, deaf to the cries of the poor, blind to the pain of the people, God does choose to respond, not with a wave of a divine hand or a magic wand, but with a person. In the first reading for this Sunday, God raises up Moses, who, remember, was a fugitive, someone who was so passionate that it sometimes got the best of him. And in a fit of rage, he had murdered an Egyptian, and when his crime became known, he had to flee, which is why he was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. God chooses Moses to lead the people out of Egypt. Today, we've seen so many people and nations rise up to help the people of Ukraine. Individuals, young and old, have left their families and homes and jobs to go to Ukraine to aid in the resistance, to offer medical supplies, or simply to volunteer in whatever way they can. People from around the world have responded with extraordinary compassion as they witness the courage of the Ukrainian president and the people. In the gospel, we hear people drawing upon recent examples of tragedies, like the slaughter in Jerusalem or the falling tower in Siloam, to ask Jesus if the people who were killed were greater sinners than others. It's the old cause and effect theology that still burdens so many people. Step out of time, step out of line, and God will punish you by having a tower fall on your head. And Paul seems to subscribe to this flawed theology in the second reading this weekend when he looks back at our ancestors in faith who were led by Moses out of slavery in Egypt only to grumble and question God in the desert. And Paul says God was not pleased with most of them, for they were struck down in the desert, while warning the people of Corinth that these things happen as an example for us so that we might not desire evil things. Jesus, though, dismisses this theology of suffering by drawing upon an image of nature in the parable of the fig tree. The lack of fruit on the fig tree caused the owner to tell the gardener to cut it down. He lost patience with it after 3 years. But the gardener pleads with the owner for more time to cultivate the ground around it, to fertilize it, so that it may bear fruit in the future. It's God's desire to always give us another chance. God gave the fugitive Moses another chance, appeared to him in a burning bush, and because Moses accepted God's call, and enslaved people were given a future. The gardener gave the fig tree another chance to bear fruit. God is not looking over our shoulder, ready to strike us down in every false move, but always inviting us to a deeper into the sacred soil of our soul to discover the truth of who we are in God's eyes. God does indeed hear our cries, knows our suffering, and responds. Maybe not in the way we prefer or in the time that we would like, but God does not leave us to suffer alone. At this juncture of our Lenten journey, we're invited to take off our shoes on the holy ground of our being and consider, where are those places in our lives where we have recognized God's presence, heard God's call, those spaces where we have met God and been reminded that we are more than the weight of our sin and less than the accomplishments of our lives. You see, we are who we are, God's beloved, children of God, and no amount of sin or accumulation of good deeds can either negate nor add to that identity. God does not condemn us even if we fail to bear the fruits of justice and peace for our world. God is the patient gardener who seeks to cultivate that ground of our being, the soil of our souls, so that one day in the not too distant future, we will harvest the fruits of justice and peace. We continue to pray for the people of Ukraine. We continue to meet in solidarity and do whatever we can to diminish the pain and suffering that they're experiencing. May God bless you. May God bless all those who are welcoming the Ukrainians fleeing the war into their homes. May we continue to meet in prayer and linger there a while. God bless.